They were already inside, not knocking, not waiting, already past the gates, already moving through the compound, already flagged and authorized and descending. And the question that started all of this, the question that should stop you cold right now, is this. If Gene Hackman died of natural causes, why did the FBI spend years in federal court fighting for legal access to what was beneath his house? Hold that question. Because the answer doesn't just change the story. It changes everything you thought you knew about the man. The world knew Gene Hackman as one of the most respected actors who ever lived. 5 Academy Award nominations. 2 wins. A career that spanned 4 decades and produced some of the most demanding, most layered performances in American cinema. Popeye Doyle in The French Connection. Raw, volatile, dangerous in a way that felt uncomfortably real. Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven. A villain who genuinely believed he was righteous, which made him more terrifying than any monster. Harry Call in The Conversation, a surveillance expert eaten alive by paranoia, a man who destroyed everything he owned searching for something hidden. That one will matter later. Norman Dale in Hoosiers, Robert Clayton Dean in Enemy of the State, a man hunted by the very intelligence apparatus he'd never asked to be near. He played surveillance, he played secrets, he played men who knew too much and couldn't unknow it. And then, in 2004, at the height of his standing, he walked away. No farewell tour, no final press run, he simply stopped. Retired to Santa Fe, New Mexico, took up painting, read voraciously, kept almost entirely to himself. The press called it quiet dignity. Fans called it earned rest. Colleagues called it characteristically private. Gene Hackman had always been the actor who showed up, did the work, and kept his personal life locked in a room no journalist was ever allowed to enter. The world knew the face. The house knew the truth. On February 26, 2025, at approximately 11 in the morning, a handyman arrived at 1425 Old Sunset Trail in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He had work to do. He had done work here before. He knew the estate. And when he arrived that morning and found something wrong, the silence too thick, the gates too still, the kind of absence that has a weight to it, he did what you do when the quiet feels like something else entirely. He called for help. Santa Fe County deputies responded. The gates were sealed. Not locked in the ordinary sense, sealed. The way a property is sealed when the person who controls it does not want it opened. Deputies forced entry. And inside the $4 million compound at 1425 Old Sunset Trail, they found Gene Hackman, 95 years old, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, both deceased. The official framing came quickly and with the kind of clean, settled language that authorities use when they want a story to close, natural causes. No signs of foul play. An elderly man and his wife, both gone. A private life that had simply ended. The kind of death that asks nothing of anyone, that fits neatly into a sentence, that gets a brief headline and a long obituary, and then fades. Except the scene didn't cooperate with that framing. Forensic investigators documented what they found inside the estate, and what they found was not the stillness of 2 people who had passed away peacefully. Furniture had been dragged. Books had been pulled from shelves. Drawers were open. The bedroom safe was open and empty, not broken into, not pried apart, but opened by someone who knew the combination or had time to work through it. And then there was the timeline, the detail buried in the early reports that most coverage skimmed past without slowing down long enough to understand what it meant. Betsy Arakawa allegedly died roughly a week before Gene Hackman. Which means, if the forensic reconstruction is accurate, Gene Hackman was alive in that house, in that compound, behind those sealed gates, for up to 7 days with his wife's body. 7 days. No call to emergency services, no call to family, no call to anyone. The gates stayed sealed. The compound stayed silent, and Gene Hackman, allegedly, stayed inside. What keeps a man silent for 7 days in a house with a dead loved one? That question has no comfortable answer. It has answers, maybe. But none of them are comfortable, and investigators, it turns out, had been sitting with versions of that question for years before Gene Hackman ever died. Because their interest in what was happening at 1425 Old Sunset Trail did not begin in February 2025. It began, according to the record, almost a decade earlier. Around 2015, something about the Hackman property began to attract federal attention. The nature of that attention was not initially about Gene Hackman the man. It was about the property itself, about what the data suggested was happening there, in the earth, in the walls, in the invisible layers of activity that surveillance infrastructure is designed to detect. Power usage at the estate was unusual. Not dramatically, not obviously, but unusual in the way that analysts notice when they're looking at patterns across time. Water usage followed a similar signature. Independently, either anomaly might mean nothing. Together, they suggested something was consuming significant resources at that location in ways that didn't match a retired man and his wife living quietly in a large house. Geological surveys conducted in the area detected seismic anomalies near the estate. Not earthquakes. Not natural geological movement. Rhythmic readings. Mechanical in character. The kind of subsurface signature that a retired geologist named Frank Delacroix, working independently with a portable seismometer, reportedly detected when he walked the perimeter of the property. He described the readings as rhythmic, mechanical, coming from beneath the ground at 2 and 3 in the morning on a regular schedule for years. A neighbor named Margaret Calloway had her own account of those nights. She reported low-frequency vibrations, not sound, exactly, but felt vibrations, the kind you notice more than hear, occurring at 2 and 3 a.m., over a period she estimated at 22 years. 22 years. Whatever was generating those vibrations had been doing so for more than 2 decades before federal investigators knocked on any courthouse door. Satellite imagery, according to sources familiar with the investigation, showed unusual changes to the property over time, modifications inconsistent with ordinary residential renovation. And then there were the communications. Encrypted communications allegedly originating from Hackman's property. The kind of encryption that doesn't come standard with consumer technology. The kind that someone installs deliberately, specifically to ensure that what moves through those channels cannot be read by anyone who intercepts it. If you're still watching this, and if you've gotten this far, you already understand why this story doesn't let go. Understand that what the FBI was building toward was not a quick raid. This was not a spontaneous decision. This was years of documented observation, years of legal process, years of Hackman's attorneys fighting back with constitutional arguments about privacy and the Fourth Amendment and the absence of direct criminal evidence, and years of federal prosecutors countering that the scale of the construction, the nature of the communications, and the years of refused inspection were themselves justification for the warrant they were seeking. The legal battle lasted nearly 3 years. A federal warrant was allegedly issued in late 2018. And on a cold January morning in 2019, more than 50 federal agents descended on 1425 Old Sunset Trail. The approach was deliberate. Reinforced gates, forced locks. The estate sitting behind stone walls and layers of security that spoke a very specific language, not the security of a wealthy man who feared ordinary crime, but the security of a location designed to prevent unauthorized access at an institutional level. 24-hour surveillance. Thermal cameras covering the perimeter. Motion sensors. Hand-picked staff according to investigators. A compound built to know who was near it before they got close. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an architectural historian at the University of New Mexico, would later describe the estate in terms that stopped people cold. "This estate looked like a museum built as a military compound," she said. The beauty was real, but so were the countermeasures. That phrase, "the beauty was real," matters here. Because nothing about what agents found on the surface was designed to look suspicious. The mansion was beautiful, curated. Museum-like in its precision and its grace, the kind of place that reads as the home of a man of taste and accomplishment and hard-won peace. Artwork positioned with intention. Books arranged with the care of someone who reads seriously. A life built to look exactly like the public image, which made what the thermal cameras found beneath the foundation all the more impossible to dismiss. The thermal imaging equipment that agents brought to the site was not deployed, because anyone expected to find anything unusual beneath the house. It was deployed as part of standard operational protocol, a full spectrum scan of the structure before interior entry, a routine measure, the kind of thing that generates unremarkable data on unremarkable properties and gets noted and filed. This property was not unremarkable. The thermal cameras detected a heat signature beneath the foundation. Not pipes. Not standard HVAC infrastructure. A signature that indicated a massive void beneath the house, a space, a chamber, something engineered and enclosed and generating the kind of thermal differential that only appears when air is being moved and temperature is being managed in a space designed for habitation or operation. A massive void. Beneath Gene Hackman's house. Structural engineers who were brought in to assess what they were dealing with would later describe the sophistication of the construction in terms that made clear this was not an eccentric hobby project or a wealthy man's whim. Whatever had been built down there required serious expertise. It required professional engineering, specialized materials, and an investment that, by their estimates, ran into the millions of dollars. Not amateur work. Not improvised. Designed, planned, and executed by people who knew exactly what they were building, and exactly why it needed to remain undetected. The deeper they built, the more perfectly they proved the verse. Agents entered Hackman's private library. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a man of his reputation. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, thousands of volumes, the accumulated reading life of a deeply literary person, organized with the kind of careful attention that reflects genuine relationship with books rather than decorative intent. It was a room built to communicate something about the person who inhabited it. Quiet. Serious. Private. And inside it, there was a mechanism. Not a secret bookcase in the cinematic sense, not a single volume pulled to reveal a door that swings open on a hidden hinge. What agents found was more deliberate than that, and more sophisticated. The entry point required a specific activation sequence, not a single trigger. A sequence, meaning that accidental discovery was not merely unlikely but effectively impossible for anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for and how to initiate it. When the sequence was completed, a section of the wall moved, and beyond it, stone steps descending into darkness. Agents took those steps. The air changed immediately. The warmth and order of the library gave way to something else, damp, metallic, cold in the specific way that underground spaces hold cold, stale in the way that sealed environments become when the only air moving through them is air that has been mechanically managed for a very long time. The walls of the passage showed markings. Schematics. The visual language of construction documentation. The kind of notations that architects and engineers make when they're building something complex enough to require ongoing reference to the original design. Something had been built down here. Something that had required schematics to construct and maintain. Something that had required seismic disturbances at 2 and 3 in the morning for 22 years if Margaret Calloway's account is accurate. Something that had required encrypted communications. Something that had required millions of dollars and professional expertise and stone walls and thermal countermeasures and an activation sequence that no one without specific knowledge could ever accidentally trigger. They were 40 feet below Gene Hackman's private library, and whatever had been built down here had not been built to be found. They were 40 feet below Gene Hackman's private library, and whatever had been built down here had not been built to be found. The tunnel extended forward. Reinforced concrete on every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, with steel ribbing at regular intervals. The kind of structural reinforcement that doesn't appear in basements or wine cellars or the harmless eccentricities of wealthy homeowners. The passage was wide. Wide enough, agents noted, for a small vehicle to pass through. Not a person squeezing sideways through a narrow corridor, a vehicle. State-of-the-art ventilation ran through the ceiling infrastructure, active, maintained, drawing fresh air through channels that had clearly been serviced recently. LED lighting lined both sides of the passage in a continuous strip, cold and even, illuminating everything without shadow. Whoever built this wanted to see clearly down here. Whoever maintained it wanted it functional. Structural engineers brought in to assess the construction would later describe what they found in terms that agents were not fully prepared for. Marcus Devlin, one of the engineers on site, was direct about what the evidence indicated. This wasn't built by the homeowner, he said. And then, after walking the full length of the accessible passage and reviewing the construction layers, the upper section was renovated, modernized, reinforced, but the core of this tunnel was already here. He paused on that. Returned to it. Hackman moved into it. He inherited it. He inherited it. That one phrase reframes everything that came before it. The 22 years of low-frequency vibrations that Margaret Calloway felt through her floors at 2 and 3 in the morning. The rhythmic mechanical readings that Frank Delacroix recorded on his portable seismometer near the property perimeter. The seismic anomalies that geological surveys had flagged years before federal investigators ever sought a warrant. If Marcus Devlin's reading of the construction layers is accurate, then this tunnel did not begin with Gene Hackman. It predated him. He arrived at 1425 Old Sunset Trail and found something already in the ground beneath it, and then, apparently, he made it his own. Richard Payne, a retired Department of Energy consultant with direct knowledge of Cold War infrastructure projects, has connected New Mexico's underground network of facilities to systems built during that era. Systems designed for continuity, for preservation, for the protection of materials and operations deemed too important to leave exposed above ground. He has not commented specifically on the Hackman estate, but the architecture of what agents found matches, in significant ways, the construction philosophy of that period. Deep, reinforced, self-sustaining, built to last beyond the people who built it. Agents kept moving. At approximately 100 feet from the entry point, the passage opened. The chamber they entered was roughly the size of a basketball court. The ceiling rose. The air shifted, warmer, drier, precisely controlled in the way that serious archival environments require. And lining every wall, from floor to ceiling, were shelves, not ordinary shelves. Climate-controlled shelving units sealed behind glass panels, monitored by equipment that tracked temperature and humidity to a fraction of a degree. The contents of those shelves stopped agents in place. Shakespeare folios. Not reproductions. Not scholarly facsimiles. First folios, among the rarest objects in the history of the English language, items that exist in fewer than 240 known copies in the entire world. Items that institutions spend generations acquiring and governments ensure at figures that require specialized actuarial frameworks. Medieval illuminated manuscripts, their gold leaf still vivid after centuries, their vellum pages intact inside sealed preservation cases. First editions of Hemingway. First editions of Fitzgerald. The specific volumes, the specific printings, the ones that collectors and institutions spend careers pursuing and rarely find. The estimated value of what was housed in that single chamber according to sources familiar with the federal inventory process, exceeds $100 million. 1. Chamber. $100 million. Beneath the library of a man the world believed had retired to paint watercolors and read quietly in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The open question, the one that hangs over every shelf in that room, is not how the collection was assembled. Wealthy people with the right connections and the right time horizon can assemble extraordinary collections. The question is, why it was here? Why underground? Why behind an activation sequence? Why beneath 40 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, rather than in the kind of carefully managed private collection that the world's wealthiest bibliophiles maintain in climate-controlled rooms in their homes? Catalogued and documented and, however privately held, acknowledged to exist. Nothing in that chamber was acknowledged to exist. At approximately 200 feet, the passage opened again into a second chamber, and this one was configured differently. Not shelves and glass cases. Equipment. Professional restoration equipment of the kind used in major film archives, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the George Eastman Museum. Humidity-controlled vaults running along the far wall, temperature regulated to the specific parameters that cellulose, nitrate, and acetate film stock require for long-term survival. And inside those vaults, according to the federal inventory that investigators began compiling on site, thousands of film reels. Not home movies. Not a collector's personal favorites. Rare Hollywood Golden Age prints, the early studio era, films that exist now in fragmentary form or not at all, the hundreds of movies from American cinema's formative decades that the industry failed to preserve and that historians have spent generations mourning. Alongside those, unreleased material. Alternate scenes. Alternate endings, the kind of footage that gets cut from final prints and disappears into studio vaults or studio fires or studio indifference. The material that film scholars spend careers trying to locate through studio archives and production records and estate sales. And then the international material. Films from Eastern Europe. Films from Asia. Films from Latin America. The cinematic output of countries and eras and industries that the American market largely ignored. That the passage of time and political upheaval and inadequate preservation infrastructure had put at genuine risk of permanent loss. Someone had been collecting them. Someone had been bringing them here, storing them under the optimal conditions for survival, maintaining the equipment needed to restore and preserve them. The man who built The Conversation, a film about a surveillance expert who records what other people don't know is being recorded, had, allegedly, spent years recording history. Preserving the irreplaceable. Hiding the evidence of his own effort beneath the ground, if that framing is accurate. At approximately 300 feet, the passage descended slightly, and the character of the space changed again entirely. The constructed environment gave way to something older. A natural cavern, the kind of geological feature that exists throughout New Mexico's subsurface, the remnant of ancient water movement through limestone, had been converted into something that had no business existing beneath a private residential property. Hydroponic gardens ran in illuminated rows, plants growing in temperature-managed conditions, their root systems suspended in nutrient solution. Their growth cycles maintained by automated systems that had been operating, by all appearances, for years. The air here was different again. Humid. Organic. Alive in a way that the preceding chambers were not. Adjacent to the garden section, a seed vault. Modeled, according to investigators familiar with the construction, on the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, the international facility built into Arctic permafrost to preserve the genetic diversity of the world's plant species against catastrophic loss. What Hackman had built, allegedly, was a private version of that concept. Preserving endangered plant species. Species extinct in the wild. rare cultivars and ancient strains of crops that industrial agriculture had displaced and that no major institutional program had prioritized for preservation, and beyond the vault, research laboratories. DNA sequencing technology, growth chambers, genetic data systems, crop resilience research, the kind of work that addresses the question of how agriculture survives the conditions that climate projections suggest are coming. Scientists had been working here, according to investigators. Bound by confidentiality agreements. Vetted. Legally constrained from discussing their work or their location or the identity of the person funding it. One framing of Hackman's motivation, the version A interpretation, the one that federal investigators have not confirmed but have not publicly rejected, suggests that he spent 15 years quietly conducting preservation work. That he described his goal as providing resources and freedom for qualified researchers to pursue important work without the usual constraints of grant applications and institutional politics. That the tunnel and the chambers and the seed vault and the film laboratory were not about secrecy for its own sake, but about the specific kind of freedom that secrecy makes possible. The freedom to work without oversight, without funding pressures, without the institutional gatekeeping that determines which knowledge gets preserved and which gets lost. The world knew the face. The house knew the truth. But the evidence of concealment is not easy to fold into a purely humanitarian narrative, and the people who tried to investigate the property above ground found that the layers of suppression were not incidental. They were systematic. Workers who had any contact with the estate signed non-disclosure agreements. Staff were handpicked, vetted, and legally bound in ways that went significantly beyond ordinary household confidentiality. Local journalists who began asking questions about unusual activity near the property hit walls of silence, not the ordinary reluctance of private individuals, but the organized, legally reinforced silence that only appears when someone has prepared for exactly this kind of inquiry. Building permits for work on the estate were mundane in their descriptions, or redacted in their specifics, or incomplete in ways that made reconstruction of the construction timeline effectively impossible from public records alone. Property records showed unexplained gaps, not errors. Not ordinary, bureaucratic inconsistency. Gaps that a trained researcher would notice and a trained researcher did notice. A Santa Fe Historical Society researcher began investigating the land records associated with 1425 Old Sunset Trail. She was thorough. She had access to historical documentation that ordinary researchers wouldn't think to pull. And then, at some point during that investigation, she stopped returning calls. Her findings were never published. The research simply ended. That kind of silence has a texture. It doesn't feel like disinterest. It feels like a door that someone closed. Inside the federal operation, the analytical work was proceeding in parallel with the physical investigation. A federal analyst, working with an internal AI system, uploaded the accumulated documentation, property records, thermal scans, body camera transcripts from the tunnel entry, the images and inventory logs from each chamber. The system processed the input and returned its assessment in the flat, precise language that AI analysis generates when it has sufficient data to identify patterns. Residential classification. Inconsistent. The property did not match the behavioral signature of a private home, even a wealthy and heavily secured one. Security density exceeds private home baseline. The countermeasures documented at the estate were categorically different in scale and sophistication from what residential security, however extreme, typically involves. Subsurface void, intentional, multi-phase, and maintained. Not accidental. Not geological. Built deliberately, built in stages over time, and actively maintained throughout. Document redaction pattern suggests protected network, not isolated homeowner behavior. The gaps in the records were not the product of one man's desire for privacy. They looked like the product of a system, a coordinated, legally managed pattern of suppression that extended beyond any single individual's capacity to arrange. The analyst asks the system directly, "Is this criminal?" The AI replied, "Insufficient data for criminal classification. Sufficient data for concealment classification." The analyst pressed further, "Can concealment be permanent?" The system's response, "No known closed system remains sealed indefinitely under death, decay, legal intervention, or environmental change." Gene Hackman was dead. His wife was dead. The sealed system had encountered exactly the conditions the AI described, and whatever had been kept beneath that house for however long it had been kept there was, for the first time, exposed to the people it had been hidden from. But the concealment classification did not resolve the question of what, exactly, had been concealed. Because at 40 feet below the private library, at the threshold where the tunnel's entry passage met the first descent, there was something that the preservation narrative, the humanitarian narrative, the version A interpretation cannot fully account for. An iron door. No exterior handle. No visible hinges, rivets along the frame. Rust at the edges, old rust, the kind that takes decades to develop, running along the lower seam. And weld marks. Along every seam, weld marks. The door had not been locked. It had been sealed. From the inside. By someone who had gone through that door and then ensured that it could not be opened from the other side. Beyond that door, according to investigators who documented what was visible through the ventilation gap before any entry attempt was made, ancient wooden crates. Yellowed documents. Rusted metallic objects. Old photographs, including one with a handwritten date 1937. Coded files. Partially burned pages, insignias of organizations that no longer exist, organizations that dissolved under circumstances that are themselves part of historical record. The floor of the space beyond the door showed circular patterns, complex, precise, geometric, that investigators described as resembling celestial maps, with star chart configurations that appeared to align with specific constellations and planetary position. And one recovered item, retrieved through the ventilation access before the sealing question was fully resolved, a palm-sized metal cylinder. Rotating internal rings. No visible seams. No obvious assembly method. Precision in its construction that, according to the engineers who examined it, exceeds what the manufacturing technology of its apparent era should have been capable of producing. The FBI has said nothing publicly about what lies beyond the welded iron barrier. Nothing. Not a statement confirming the chamber's existence. Not a statement denying it. Not a press conference, not a leaked briefing, not the kind of selective disclosure that agencies use when they want to manage a narrative without closing it. Complete silence. The kind of silence that is itself a form of communication, if you know how to read it. Dr. James Whitfield spent 19 years as an FBI forensic analyst processing classified evidence. He understands, from direct professional experience, what different kinds of agency silence mean and where they come from. His interpretation of the official response to this investigation is not ambiguous. When an agency goes this quiet, this fast, Whitfield said, it means one of two things. Either they found nothing and they're embarrassed, or they found something so significant that the disclosure conversation has moved above the investigative team. He was asked which interpretation he believed applied here. This doesn't look like embarrassment, he said. If you followed this far, if you've been inside this tunnel alongside the agents, if you've walked through the rare book chamber and the film laboratory and the seed vault and stood in front of an iron door welded from the inside, then you already know that this story is not finished. It may not finish cleanly. It may not finish at all. What we're asking you to do right now is simple. Tell us what you believe is behind that door. Drop it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next layer surfaces, because the federal record on this property is still active. and what gets disclosed next will either confirm one of these versions or produce a third one that neither of us has considered yet. The thing about sealed systems is that they don't stay sealed. The AI got that right, at least. Gene Hackman was alive in that house for up to 7 days with his wife's body. The bedroom safe was open and empty. The internal cameras had been disabled, not malfunctioned, not aged out of function, disabled, deliberately, by someone who understood what they were doing and why. The tunnel was sealed at the entry point. The iron door was welded from the inside, and the man who once played a surveillance expert dismantling his own apartment piece by piece searching for a hidden recording, who played a man hunted by a government intelligence apparatus he never asked to be near, spent the last chapter of his life in a house that contained beneath its library floor one of the most significant and most deliberately hidden underground structures ever documented on a private residential property in American history. The Smithsonian Institution, according to sources with knowledge of the federal inventory process, has expressed interest in housing parts of the collections found in the tunnel chambers. Which means that what was hidden for decades beneath one man's private estate may end up in public institutions that millions of people visit every year, displayed behind glass, labeled with catalog numbers, attributed to donors who will or will not be named, depending on what the disclosure conversation above the investigative team ultimately decides. Gene Hackman's final role wasn't on screen. It was underground. And the script for that role, the full version, the uncut version, the version with whatever alternate ending is sealed behind an iron door 40 feet beneath the private library of a man who walked away from Hollywood 20 years before he died, that script has not been released. Was Hackman the last guardian of something buried long before he was born? Or was he its final prisoner? The door is welded from the inside. Whoever sealed it knew they weren't coming back out.